Hello, everyone. Welcome. Gonna get this started in just a few minutes here. My name is Meghna. I am the event manager here at Book Larder. We're in the Fremont neighborhood in Seattle. If you are just joining us tonight, feel free to type into the chat where you are listening from tonight. If you just select the to everyone option there, then everyone on tonight's event will be able to see your message. Is everyone staying dry out there? This wind is like blowing my mind a little bit. Okay, give this just a few more minutes for our numbers to level off here. Again, my name is Meghna Jarati. I am the event manager here at Book Larder in Seattle in the Fremont neighborhood. We are a cookbook store. We also have a really great selection of food writing, including A Good Drink. Tonight's book of choice, we're going to be hearing later today from Shanna Farrell, who's the author of A Good Drink, and Paul Clarke, who's an executive editor at Imbibe magazine in Portland. But before we get started, I just want to give you all a lay of the land, a little bit of what to expect. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to share any comments and general thoughts during the event. You can use that to talk to each other and just give general feedback. And you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions for Shanna or Paul. We will get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the event. So please do come ready with your questions. We'll get to as many as we can during the course of the event. Copies of A Good Drink are available at booklarder.com. I will put a link into the chat for anyone that's interested in purchasing a copy. We do have signed book-plated copies, so thank you, Shanna, for sending those on to us. You can support this author tag by purchasing your copy from us or from your favorite independent bookstore. All right, so before I welcome Shanna and Paul to the Zoom room, I just want to read their bios real quickly so you all have a little bit of an idea of who they are. Shanna Farrell is an interviewer at UC Berkeley's Oral History Center, where she works on a wide variety of projects and specializes in drink, cultural, and environmental history. She's the author of Bay Area Cocktails. Her writing has appeared in Imbibe magazine, Life and Time, Punch, and the San Francisco Chronicle. She holds a master's degree from both New York University and Columbia University. And she's the author of this fantastic book that we're going to hear about today. Shanna is joined by Paul Clarke. Paul is Imbibe's executive editor and the author of the Cocktail Chronicles, Navigating the Cocktail Renaissance with Jigger, Shaker, and Glass, released in July 2015. He believes in the importance of a diverse liquid diet. It's my great pleasure to welcome both Shanna and Paul to the Zoom room. Thanks so much for taking the time to join our virtual audience tonight. Really means a lot, and we're just so happy to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'll let you two take it away.
Thank you.
Great. Shanna, do you want to start things off?
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to start things off with a reading. It's going to be from chapter 3 about gin and vodka. And I think the only thing you really need to know is that the two people that I'm highlighting in the book are from Denver, Colorado, part of the Leopold Brothers, Todd and Scott Leopold. And Todd is the distiller and Scott is an environmental engineer. And I spent most of my visit with Scott out there. All right, so chapter 3, gin and vodka. I am a person who makes New Year's resolutions. I don't remember most of them, but I do remember one I made in 2010. Drink more gin. I was in graduate school when cocktails became a bigger part of my life, owing mostly to my bartending job in Brooklyn. I dove into cocktail history, reading a handful of books, mostly to keep my job interesting, but also to get better at it. Recipe after recipe, classic and contemporary, called for gin. I was not much of a gin drinker before that. I'd never gone through that phase in college because I liked whiskey better. Sure, I drank some gin over the years, but the piney taste put me off. Whenever I'd try it, all I could think of was the Pine Sol cleaner that my mother used to polish furniture. The fateful year I decided I needed to be a more adventurous drinker, gin was in my crosshairs. The dawn of that new decade brought what seemed like hundreds of distilleries to the Northeast, especially Brooklyn. Gin was unavoidable, and once I started paying attention, my options were limitless. It took me a few tries to find my cocktail of choice, but soon Negronis and Bijous crept their way into my frequently ordered drink rotation. I haven't looked back. It wasn't until I moved to California in 2013, with my feet tucked underneath a bar stool, that I started noticing one brand in particular, Leopold Bros. One day, my interest peaked after seeing their gin on shelf after shelf, and so I ordered it in a Negroni. The drink was nuanced, balanced, and layered. There was no taste of Pine Sol. There were no memories of dust. As time wore on, I found that the Leopold brothers were creeping into more of my conversations. Friends who visited Denver went to the distillery, returning with bottles of gin as gifts. Distillers who knew them talked about their work during our interviews, citing them as industry leaders. Bartenders I respected used their products. Magazines I read kept featuring them in articles. One of these articles profiled a lauded San Francisco bar owner, Thad Vogler. At the time, Thad owned several bars, including the James Beard Foundation award-winning Bar Agricole. I had come to know Thad while doing an oral history interview with him, and over the course of the hours we spent talking, he went into detail about how spirits are agricultural products and why we should treat them that way. Bar Agricole, more than any other bar in the country, embodied this philosophy. They refer to themselves as a farm bar. They source all of their products meticulously. They want their producers to be environmentally conscious, and they want their drinks to taste good. While Bar Agricole carries mostly European-produced spirits, Leopold Bros is among the few they stock that are made in the US. After talking with Thad and drinking the Leopold Brothers gin, I got curious about them. I learned that sustainable distilling practices had been central to their business model from the very beginning. Their systems are designed to reduce waste, water, energy, transportation, and food, and they support local farmers and flavors. They too treat drinking as an agricultural act. And with that, I booked a flight to Colorado. And then I'm going to skip ahead real quick and read just another page. Unlike the Leopold brothers, most distilleries buy vodka from a mass producer, such as Midwest Grain Products of Indiana, commonly known as MGP. The company, famous for its lack of transparency, tight-lipped employees, and windowless buildings, makes spirits and sells them to private labels. MGP produces whiskey for more than 50 brands. It's the spirit industry's prime example of industrialization. Ingredients are detached from the food system and treated as a commodity. With faceless companies like this, it's hard to monitor where the raw material is coming from or what's going into the bottle and into our bodies. The base spirit must be shipped to distillery. The base spirits must be shipped to the distillery, which takes energy and resources for fuel and hauling. It's a wasteful process, but one that most distilleries are willing to use to get a profitable product to market. Hundreds of liqueurs are currently available for sale in the US, many of them using vodka, sometimes referred to as a neutral grain spirit as their base. This is where things get sticky. Most of these liqueurs are fruit flavored, grapefruit, or pamplemousse if you're fancy, pamplemousse, peach, banana, and cherry. While many companies do include fruit in their ingredients list, there are a host of artificial additives in the bottle too, like high fructose corn syrup, like red dye number 40, like caramel coloring, like petroleum, artificial sweeteners, thickening agents, and synthetic chemicals, things we don't want in our food, but tolerate in our drinks because we're unlikely aware that they are there. Not the Leopolds. Their rule of thumb is to treat alcohol like food. If I wouldn't eat it, why would I drink it? Scott emphasizes. Instead, they visit farms, talk to growers, and expect crops to be slightly different each year. They adjust accordingly with the seasons. This makes everything taste better. It's fresher, more vibrant, more alive. Their vodka has another identity too, gin. All gin is basically flavored vodka, says Scott, so that's the base. Gin, by definition, is a neutral grain spirit that must have juniper in it. That's it. It can have any other type of botanical as long as juniper is one of them. Todd practices fractional distilling when making their gin. This means they distill each botanical individually and blend the batches together. Why do this? Botanicals, like food, don't all cook at the same temperature or for the same amount of time. What Todd did, which speaks to a little bit of the black magic of distilling, is recognize that every botanical is going to cook differently, Scott says. They all have different boiling points. As he's telling me this, I notice big plastic jugs called carboys that are clustered near one of the stills. You can think of it in terms of food, Scott continues. You wouldn't take a steak, potato, and a vegetable and put them in the oven at the same time and expect a flawless meal. So Todd separates everything, and he's making decisions with individual plates in each still and cuts on one botanical. So he's just distilling juniper, and then coriander, and then bergamot. He's getting the hearts of every single botanical, only the purest flavors and purest alcohol, and blending them together. And the carboys that I'm looking at contain each of these batches, waiting for Todd to blend them. Yeah, a little bit from chapter 3.
Right. Well, I'm really glad that you started with that and that brought us in talking about both Leopold Brothers and Thad Vogler, but also, this is kind of a recurring theme in the book as I was going through it earlier. So first of all, let me just back up and say, it's really great to see a book on sustainability as it relates to spirits and cocktails and the hospitality industry come out now. And it's something that obviously has been a subject of conversation within the food world for many years. It's been going on within the drinks world, kind of like inside in industry events, but to actually have it coming out in a much more public manner like this, it's really time for something like this. And, depending on how it's used, sustainability is a topic or buzzword that we hear a lot at these kind of conferences. And so I like the way that how you're detailing the way that some distillers and bar owners are taking this kind of serious approach to ecological responsibility. Now, to take a point that you just had, and then you bring up in the book, it's not at all unusual nowadays to go into a restaurant and, you're handed the menu and you'll know the name of the farm where the carrots were grown and, the farm where the chicken was raised and all of those things, all of that nature. But when you order the cocktail from the bar, then you're kind of in a wilderness of, products that may have additives, the products that may be from around the world that have very different set of standards as compared to the food. How did that kind of dichotomy appeal to you as you started getting into this, and what did you want to help readers understand about the reality of those spirits?
Yeah, that's exactly where this project started. Moving to California and living in a place where, as you said, a lot of these menus have the farms, where everything is made, and then you flip over to the cocktail side. And I had already started to do a little bit of research into some liqueurs that had artificial dyes or things in there, and asking for an alternative. And in a Negroni, for example, and the bartender looks at me like I have 6 heads and doesn't understand why I'm asking for an alternative. And so I felt like I was hitting on something a little bit, like, why do we accept these things in our drinks, but not in our food? And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. I think regulation is one, and how they're regulated, but also because we're not really asked to think deeply about these things. And I think you're right. In the spirit world, when we talk about sustainability, a lot of times it's on the cocktail side, but really the spirits are the base ingredient, and they're the ones that they're the things that are going to give the drink the most flavor. So I really wanted to dig a little deeper, and my background's in environmental history and just environmental studies. So I was kind of applying some of those principles to a job that I had held for 15 years.
Right. And, there are a number of different ways to come at the topic of sustainability. And you start off the book and you come back to several times on the subject of monoculture and biodiversity. So why don't we start there? And if we can kind of look at two things. First off, you talk about whiskey or bourbon whiskey in particular, but also then you get into agave spirits. Let's start off with whiskey. You mentioned our mutual friends, Ann Marshall and Scott Blackwell at High Wire Distilling in Charleston, and how their interest in making bourbon led them to tracking down a particular type of corn. Take us down that path a little bit, how they got there.
Yeah, I love this story because I feel like it's such an illustration of what happens when you do have a connection to the land and what all comes out from that, because it's not just a good tasting bourbon. But yeah, I had met them at a conference in Charleston several years ago. And I think that the reason I went to that conference was there was a seminar called Drinking as an Agricultural Act. And I was like, wow, this is exactly what I'm thinking about. And Anne was on the panel talking about how she had created a direct relationship with a farm. This was before the Jimmy Red had come out. I think they were aging it at this point. And so after the conference, I emailed her and I wanted to know a little bit more. And so I started having some conversations with them. And then the next year at the same conference, went down and interviewed them. And they were gracious enough to let me tag along with them to one of the farms where they were producing, or they were growing some of this Jimmy Red. And through that, it's a small, it's a family-owned farm. There's a couple of I think it's a couple of generations of people who had owned the farm, and the different family members have different plots of land. And so as a favor, they were growing this type of corn for Scott and Anne. And it was, they had to really think about how are we solving for weather and critters and things like that, but also what can we grow around it that will help, it's not a monoculture farm. So what can we grow around it that will help support this corn? And so, digging into that a little bit and looking at how corn can be grown in not just the Midwest, but places like the Low Country and what that does for the flavor. And then getting to try some of that bourbon and just tasting nothing like it. I also had the opportunity to try, they were using at that time corn that was grown on 3 different farms around Charleston. And I tried each one individually before it was blended together, and they all tasted different. And so you think about terroir and wine, but not always spirits. And you could totally get a sense of the terroir. And I think, you're tasting everything that goes into it, and the not using GMO corn, not using pesticides. It just, I think, brought so much of it out.
Right. And, so by comparison, most bourbons, if you go into your local bar and you just order, a glass of one of the major brands, those are all made primarily using yellow dent corn, as you talk about in the book. How do varieties like, sorry, my cat, how do varieties like Jimmy Red or Bloody Butcher, which we've seen a number of other distilleries using, what kinds of possibilities do those provide distillers, both from an ecological standpoint, but also from a flavor standpoint?
I think alternatives, and also a way to find your unique voice in a very crowded market. Scott and Anne were able to produce something that was of South Carolina. It really reflects the region and their philosophy and working directly with the farms. But other places, I know that there's a distiller up in Pennsylvania that's using locally grown corn there. So it's that sense of place. But also, I think, with yellow dent, that corn is used because it's so consistent. People don't want variation, and you don't want it to taste differently year to year. There are ways to solve for that, as other distillers in the book I talk about with blending. But you don't really have to worry. It's drought resistant. The weather's not going to be that big of an issue. But if when you start to sort of dig in and see what the alternatives are, you can make a meaningful relationship with a farmer. You can ask them to use no GMOs or heirloom varietals. So you have a lot more control over things. And then also it's cheaper too. Like you can, if the transportation is a lot closer because it's local, or you can negotiate a lower rate when you're working directly with someone, you're kind of cutting out the middle person. That all makes a difference, I think. And then also you can imbue your philosophy and your flavor into things. And so it'll taste different.
Right, right. And now, by comparison, let's talk about agave because, with corn, this is something, it's an annual crop. You can, do an experimental batch with a heirloom variety. Agave is a totally different thing. Agave matures much slower. We're talking about a number of years for plants to mature. And it's also, we've seen kind of the realities of what can happen with monoculture in tequila. So I guess a couple of questions there. What have been some of the experiences in tequila with relying on one variety of agave and intense cultivation of that variety? And how can that be, or should that be, a warning sign for mezcal producers?
Yeah, I think, mezcal, tequila is a type of mezcal. Tequila can only be, for those who are uninitiated, can only be produced in the state of Jalisco with Blue Weber agave. So it's one type of agave. Agave takes years, anywhere from 6 to 20 plus years to mature, depending on what varietal of agave you're interested in using. And because tequila got so popular, particularly in the United States, there was a really big demand to grow more. So there are cycles of boom and bust that happen with agave in Mexico. You can plant a lot of agave, but a lot of them are made from clones, and that means that they're a little less hardy and they're more susceptible to viruses, or I think weevils are a big sort of critter that goes in and eats them. So when there's no when it's monocropping and it's only one type of crop, if you're not planting other things as barriers, it just you're basically like leaving your field sort of open and very vulnerable. And so there's been different cycles in Mexico, in Jalisco, that have happened with, we grow a ton and then crops get they get wiped out, and then there's all this demand for tequila, but we don't have any agave to use to make it, so prices go up, and then people plant more, and then there are times when there's a surplus, so prices go down. So it's just, it fluctuates wildly. And then also it's just sort of over harvesting. I think that you're not, the plant, I don't know, just with the plants become a little less interesting too, because you're not using other types of varietals in there. So it's not tasting as different. But it has a real effect. And one of the reasons that I am talking about mezcal in the book is because a lot of this sort of boom and bust, let's cash in now when the demand is high, is because a lot of this is happening for mezcal. And I think people in the US don't necessarily understand how, our drinking trends can affect other places. And so I was really interested in the agave chapter in talking to someone from Mexico who understands what the stakes are and also what the history and the culture is. Somebody who's really interested in preserving that, because a lot gets lost also with the farming techniques, the production techniques, that kind of thing. And I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but yeah.
Well, no, I think you're on a very good point there. And as you detail in the book, mezcal presents some interesting challenges and questions, especially when we see tequila's experience. As you were saying, tequila is made from one variety of agave and these kind of large farms, intensely cultivated. Mezcal from a variety of types of agave, some of which are wild growing. When you see mezcal's popularity take off and its intense, its popularity in the market, in some ways, it's almost impossible to look at that and not feel frightened for agave, both for biodiversity and agave, and for the communities that are relying upon this, the kinds of pressures that can come down onto it.
Yeah, I think so. And it's happening where a lot of companies are coming in and saying, sort of, give me as much as you can because you can get paid more money to do this. And what's interesting, so I talked to Pedro Jimenez, who is the proprietor of Mizonte, which is a company that works with, they don't make their own mezcal, but they work with different producers who do. And he has conversations with them about, what are your goals? How are you making these things? Do you need more money? What does that look like? Can we do that without growing more and overtaxing the environment? He's really interested in keeping the ecosystem in balance to ensure that we can grow more agave in the years to come, and we'll all still be able to have mezcal in the future, and preserving a lot of those historic distilling techniques, often, which means that they're very small batch. Another really unique thing I think about Mizonte is they like to keep most of their tequila, or their mezcal in Mexico. They don't export a lot. But if a producer is like, look, I need to build a new house, or I need a new equipment, I need to make more money, they have a conversation about like, well, can we export it? Because you're going to make more money if we export. So it's this really delicate balance that they're trying to find that kind of serves everyone in a beneficial way, instead of just having a faceless company come in and say, we'll put in internet cables here if you sell us all this stuff. We can make these infrastructure improvements, which don't always benefit, the community. It's not like a conversation that some of these companies are having about what works best for you. How can we best serve you for the long term?
Right. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about energy use and water use. And for folks who haven't visited a distillery, or especially a large distillery, distilleries can be really problematic when in terms of water and energy use and waste production as well. You bring in the example of Leopold Brothers that you kicked off the conversation with in Colorado as moving in a different direction and moving intentionally in a different direction. How did they head down that path?
So they have a really interesting story. Todd gets a lot of love because he's the distiller. So he's doing the black magic and making the thing that we all love drinking. But Scott's background is in environmental engineering. And before they started as a brewery, and then they expanded into a distillery. And before they were working on the brewery, he was actually working as an environmental consultant for mostly Fortune 500 companies who were violating environmental regulations, or, they had dumped too much something in this river or something, and they had to pay a fine, and they had to improve how they're doing things. And so he, didn't have a blueprint for any of these things, but was going to these different companies and saying, what are you doing now? How can we make this better? What are the limits there? And so he was really designing at that point the system that would work for lots of different companies. And then they opened the brewery, they opened the distillery in Michigan, and later moved to Colorado. And when you go to their distillery now, you can't really tell when you walk in, but having the conversation with them, there's all this like piping on the walls, and their fermentation tanks are wooden, and the windows are open, and they have like ceiling fans. There's native grasses and things that are built around the building. So everything is in service of reducing waste, using less water, using less wooden fermentation tanks. You can't really use chemicals because they seep into the wood. So they're using natural products to clean things. And so everything is in service of the bottom line, which is the environment essentially. And a lot of that came from Scott. He is the one who is behind a lot of that, and conversation with Todd about, sourcing ingredients, making sure that everything is within a certain mile radius from their distillery, building a malting facility so they can make their own neutral grain spirit, like a vodka that they can then use for their liqueurs and things like that. So, I don't really hesitate in saying that I think that they're the most environmentally advanced distillery in the country.
And, it used to be years ago, you would travel around to distilleries and you would be shown, kind of like one example of something that a place would be doing correctly. Now it is kind of heartening to see a number of distilleries that are making these kinds of investments or doing things of that nature. We can think of some of the larger distilleries like Bruichladdich in Scotland is moving in a very positive direction. A lot of the Scottish whiskey distilleries, and as well as a lot of the craft distilleries here in the United States. A minute ago, when we were talking about agriculture, we're mainly talking about monoculture as it relates to whiskey and to agave, but there's also the sourcing of base materials and the way that those materials are grown. And that gets really interesting and problematic when we get into the rum world. Rum has lots of baggage. It comes comes with rum. Just looking solely at the production side of it, traditionally it had been made from the sugarcane and the molasses from where it was grown, because it was basically a byproduct of the sugar industry historically. But the world doesn't really operate that way anymore. A lot of these islands may not have a significant sugarcane crop or significant sugar refineries. So a lot of the rum, a lot of the commodity rum that you see is made from sugarcane or molasses that may have been grown or processed many miles away from where it actually wound up in a distillery. You bring in a couple of examples in the book of people who are doing things a little bit differently. One of them is Equiano, which is a blend of rums from Barbados and Mauritius, and the other is Montana rum from Colorado. How do these both head in different directions in terms of their sourcing and their integrity and paying attention to their base materials and ingredients?
Yeah, they were two really interesting examples. So I started talking to Ian Burrell, who's one of the founders of Equiano, because they're talking about using no additives. And I thought that was as you mentioned, rum is a very complicated topic. And I don't know that I was the one to tell that history. So I was like, well, what can I focus on? And the additives part, he is very interested in being transparent as possible. So where's the sugarcane grown? We're not using additives. What does that look like? What does that mean? And so that their identity is really bound in not using additives, and also where the cane is coming from. And I think that they're at this point trying to use organic non-GMO sugar cane in both Barbados and Mauritius, where they're getting both their canes from. And so their approach is the environment is one component, but it's also about identity. Equiano is named after the man who was enslaved and then freed himself by being a rum runner and ended up writing a book. And so he's also taking into consideration colonization in the rum. And I think that those get unpacked a little bit through how they're doing things. And I did feel very conflicted about, I'd heard of Montana and was really interested in talking to them. They're a certified B Corp distillery, so they have to measure every single thing they use, whether that's the ink that goes on their labels or the amount of water they use, that kind of thing. But I felt very conflicted about using or featuring a distillery that's based in Colorado, where sugarcane does not grow, because this is a place where local is not necessarily the thing they can do. But in the course of talking to Karen Hoskin, who's the founder, she was really interested in going to Louisiana and working with a small family farm. It's a co-op. I think there's several generations, non-GMO. With sugarcane, you can't really practice crop rotation. But there's also very problematic practices with harvesting and labor. And she went down to visit and talked to them about how they were doing things and kind of looked at, how is the labor looking? Does this seem fair? So it's not, it starts from the base ingredients in rum and just sort of works its way out into every layer of the process.
Right. And I think that's important as well, looking at the communities that are part of this, whether it's, as we were saying earlier with Mezcal, the communities that are harvesting the agave and processing and making the Mezcal, or to the communities that are raising the sugarcane. Recognizing that distilleries don't exist in a vacuum, that they have these kinds of things going on around them. And you bring that in another way, in a very different kind of locale later in the book, with talking about St. George spirits in Alameda, California, and the brandies that they make. And, how originally, back in the day, Jorg was sourcing the pears for their magnificent pear brandy from relatively locally within the Bay Area, Greater Bay Area. But due to a combination of changes, economic changes, agricultural conditions, climate change, they've had to change their approach. How has that been following out for them?
Yeah, so this chapter was, they're local here, so I can go visit them. I've spent a lot of time in that distillery. But one thing that's always in the backdrop with Northern California is both wine and also fire and drought, and the way that that's affecting the state. And both of those factors impact where St. George can source their pears from. The spirit, they started with eau de vie the thing they started from. And they're, the oldest craft distillery in the country, opened in 1982, the first one after Prohibition. So I was also really interested in looking at, like, how do you keep something consistent with all these pressures over time? Jorg did used to get his pears from Mendocino, but then all of the orchards got ripped up to plant Pinot Noir grapes. And I think that also had something to do with Sideways, because I've heard here that after Sideways came out, everyone was interested in Pinot Noir. So, you look at the timing, and that actually makes sense with when they kind of had to stop sourcing here. And then they went actually to Colorado to get some of the pears because they were very similar in size and flavor, and also good farming practices. And slowly over time, they've been able to build relationships back in California with pear producers that would work for the type of pear they were looking for. But meanwhile, the state is getting ravaged by fire and drought. So their pears, smoked taint is something that gets talked a lot about in wine, but it's also something that's starting to become a problem for distilleries, especially when you're using fruit and you're making a brandy. They've thought about bottling making a smoke tainted spirit, just to sort of catalog what the conditions were like that year. They're really all about capturing the essence of the fruit and telling the story through the fruit in their bottles. And so, it's really interesting. I think that I was having lunch with the master distiller's wife the day that the Paradise Fire broke out. And I remember we were sitting outside, and both of us were like, do you smell that? And this was before the news had broke that the town was on fire. So these are things that are happening all the time. It's just always in the background. During one of the fires, both Jorg had to evacuate, and one of the other master distillers, his parents had to evacuate. So, it's a lot of give and take. And then also with drought, talking to Lance Winters, he was pretty honest and was like, during drought, we should all just stop what we're doing because it's so water intensive, but we have a business to run and there's people to support that rely on this. So we can't really do that. And so, the trade-offs there are really interesting.
Yeah. And now, you were mentioning early on that your work as a bartender and you work in bars, and years ago, the conversation, about sustainability, when it first kind of came into the conversation, we were talking about things like food waste or, burning your ice at the end of a shift. We moved on to plastic straws at one point. And that conversation is still evolving. How have you seen bar owners and bar professionals refine their understanding of what it means to operate sustainably and what they can do within their bar and what they need to do in the years to come?
It's been interesting. Bar Agricole is a model of sourcing. And at one point, Thad didn't want to use, at another program he was working on, didn't want to use citrus because it doesn't grow all year round. I think that's a little extreme. People want margaritas. It's really hard to say no because they're, limes aren't in season. But, talking to a few other people like Ryan Chetty from the UK, who worked on the Dandelion Bar and White Lion and things like that, and eliminating ice from programs. In the US, you can't do this, but in the UK, you can actually buy base spirits in bulk. So you're reducing a lot of single bottles or, packaging and that kind of thing, or even shipping costs if you're buying it in bulk. I hope the US gets there at some point. And then also talking to a couple of other people who were really interested in reusing ingredients and giving them a second and third life. And then also going to bars and doing pop-ups to kind of say, like, this is how you can do things in a more environmentally friendly way. It was interesting over the course of writing this book, though, that those folks started to really think about this is the Trash Collective folks, who were really starting to say, when we're reusing ingredients again and again, we still have to buy things to keep adding to them. So it's not actually making it less, our carbon footprint isn't actually less. So they, at the end, were sort of like, we should be thinking about how to source things. But I do think that the ice, if you batch a cocktail and you add water, so you can just, I know at the Perennial, which was a restaurant in San Francisco, the bar director there had been freezing ice in the glasses, batching the drinks, putting, adding, pre-diluting things, just pouring it over ice so you don't have any stirring waste or that kind of thing. I'm lucky to live in California where composting is a municipal service. So a lot of bars here compost. I will say that around the country, as much as I really dislike how everyone sort of hung their hats on the plastic straw debate, I think it did help kind of move the conversation a bit and be like, well, if we're eliminating plastic straws, everyone thought that customers were going to get really upset. And then no one really cared when the plastic straws went away. So I think that helped move things, though I do think a lot of these bars are still a little bit siloed, and I'm hoping that there can be more of a movement to come out of this.
Right, right. And I think, part of the understanding is that yes, we have power over what we can do in our individual bar and our water use, but also there are these things that are seemingly out of your control, like you were talking about packaging. Bars do have a power, and bar owners do have a power in relaying that information along to producers and organizations, like the Distilled Spirits Council, which is, actively lobbies for the distilled spirits industry. A lot of times it's regulations, liquor has to be packaged in a certain size bottle in the United States for sale. Those, in some cases, those are the things that are standing in the way of reaching a system like you were talking about in the UK, of bulk buy spirits and things of that nature. For sustainability to really kind of, the proverbial rubber hitting the road, it's great to have craft distillers like Leopold Brothers and St. George pursuing this and making it a big part of their operations. But it's also, we need to have the big distillers on board. We need to have the big companies that have lots of money, lots of personnel, and lots of power, lots of political power as well. You bring in the example of Maker's Mark late in the book of a distillery that you visited. That's definitely a big company. That's part of a even bigger global liquor company. What was that experience like, and where do we need to see these large distillers going, and the kind of role that they need to be playing in the sustainability conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I went down to Maker's Mark, I was very skeptical because, there's these questions of scale. I actually remember what got me thinking about this was I ran into Thad Vogler at a coffee shop, and I was telling him about Jimmy Red corn bourbon from Highwire, and he started laughing, and I was like, well, what are you laughing about? And he was like, well, how do you scale that? And this was an interesting question because I was like, oh, I don't know. I mean, it's this like little precious thing that people love, but you can't get in California. So Maker's Mark you can get everywhere, including in other countries, and they're huge. And so I was like, can you be sustainable? I don't know. And so when I got down there, they say that they practice radical transparency. And so I was like, I'm really interested in kind of digging into, do you really practice radical transparency? And they took me on a few different tours, and I met with, I think really what happened was it started with a person a number of years ago. It was like one person being like, we have this, all of this land. We need to start really thinking about how we're caring for the land. So I think that they're less concerned about sourcing ingredients. They do source their corn from a fourth generation family owned corn, but the trade-off there is they use conventionally grown yellow dent. But they're really thinking about how can we be good stewards of this land, mostly for their bottom line. So like, how do we continue making money over years to come? And it kind of, I think with their environmental work, it sort of snowballed from there. There were more people. I think now they have a team of people. But when I went down to visit, the person who was working there at the time was taking me around to look at the watershed that they have. And on their campus, there's a 101 acre watershed. They, I think, own 100 of those acres. So all the water they use comes from that watershed, whether that's cooking the mash, distilling, cutting, cleaning, like it's everything from that watershed. So they have a real vested interest in making sure that water supply stays healthy. And so that was an interesting way to look at things. They're also really interested in forest health, and I was not expecting that. Working with different initiatives in forest regeneration, in Kentucky, you have to use brand new oak that's never been used before. And so that's just an incredibly wasteful process. So they're thinking about how to, work in, how do you make sure forests are going to be around for years to come, because it'll decimate the industry there if something happens with that. And then the other thing too, I was also really interested when they got bought by this big company, what do they do with that infusion of cash? And one thing they did was, I think all of the new buildings that they're building are LEED certified buildings. So they are thinking about energy and that kind of thing. There's a lot of trade-offs that they're making, and I don't know that it'll ever be perfect, but I do think that in a lot of these stories, the idea is that it illustrates a spectrum of approaches, and it doesn't have to be a one size fits all, because what matters for agave will be different from what matters to pears or to corn or that kind of thing. So like, can we do more than just throw up solar panels and call ourselves sustainable? What's the, is there a happy medium between doing that and building from scratch a water efficient system in your distillery? So, that was an interesting perspective.
Right. And ultimately, I mean, these things are going to affect their bottom line, whether it's, the availability of oak for making your barrels, or the effects of climate change on the whiskey maturing in those barrels. It's going to be something that, like it or not, the industry is going to have to deal with. Mm-hmm. We have questions.
Yes, we do. Hi, Shanna. Hi, Paul. Such an engaging discussion. There's like so much ground to cover here. Okay, so for a reminder for anyone that's listening at home, if you have any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. Our first question is from Carla. Carla asks, do you have any suggestions for what individual consumers can do to encourage purchasers at local bars and restaurants adjusting their buying? Is this even feasible?
So I would really hesitate. I would caution against people going into a bar and saying, oh, can I have an old fashioned, but also, can you tell me where your ingredients come from? And that, like, they're not going to know. I think that's a tall order for bartenders.
Sugar regional.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think it's a little too hard, but I do think that there is an opportunity to do that at liquor stores and talking to people who do have that buying power. Like if you go into the retail shop and you're like, hey, I'm really interested in a whiskey that's made from ingredients that are local to that place. Do you have any? And just maybe they won't know, but at least you started to ask those questions. I also am a big fan of, if there's a particular, like if I want a gin and tonic and I want a Leopold's, so I'll go in and I'll say, like, do you have a Leopold, like, do you have the summer gin or something? So I'll ask for that instead of asking how ingredients are sourced. And I think that those questions can help the conversation move forward, or at least it signals to the bartenders, the bar owners, the retail shops that people are thinking about this and the demand is there.
Yeah, bartenders and bar owners are looking for interesting things that will sell, and that includes gins like Leopold Brothers or Jimmy Red Corn Bourbon, things of that nature. If getting those conversations started in that kind of positive way and ordering it when you go in, it kind of shows that there's something to back it up.
That's really great advice. And as a fellow retail store worker, I can say that, yeah, definitely your feedback as customers and what you're asking for certainly makes its way back to our publicists and our publishers. So at least in the book world, that applies as well. Let's see. If there are any other questions, you can again drop them into the Q&A. Otherwise, we will continue our conversation. I actually had a question for you, Shanna, if that was okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background in oral history and how that folded into the making of this book?
Sure. So I don't know that like one had to do with the other, but I really like asking questions. I'm pretty inquisitive. I thought oral history, my background's in music, so there's a recording component. And so I thought that those kind of work together. So I ended up getting my master's in oral history. And when I was working on an environmental / community history of the Hudson River and looking at how water pollution affected different communities differently. And I was bartending at the time, and I was aware of a distillery that was set up along the banks of the Hudson or close by. And so we had this whiskey that they made at the bar I was working at. And so I remember being in grad school and asking my cohort, like, do you think it would be interesting to include this distiller in this project? And everyone was like, yeah, that would be really cool. So I ended up doing an oral history interview with them and like learning so much about this field that I had been working in for a while and using to support myself through grad school and that kind of thing. And then at one point I was, I was living in New York during sort of the cocktail revival, and I had interest in doing an oral history with some of the bars in New York that helped spring that up. But then when I got a job at UC Berkeley, we do have a really long history of doing like food and agriculture and wine interviews. And so my boss let me do a few interviews that related to this. And I kind of just dug a little deeper every time. Yeah.
Took off from there. That's awesome. We've got a few more questions that came through. An anonymous attendee says, your book is a real opener. Have you received any feedback, positive or negative, from non-environmentally friendly companies in the spirit industry? And do you see a positive movement for sustainability happening?
I haven't heard from anybody who's non-environmentally friendly. Most of the people are. But I'm a pretty optimistic person by nature, so I am hopeful that there will be more sustainability happening. I don't know, Paul, have you been seeing in your work companies be more interested in the environmental side?
I think so. And I think it was partially what I was saying earlier, where, it's like it or not, you're going to have to deal with this, both from a market basis, from, there are going to be consumers, including large buyers like hotel groups, restaurant groups, things of that nature, that are asking these kinds of questions, and that you need to address that. I think, an example of that is, you're talking about GMO-free grain. A lot of large bourbon producers use GMO-free grain, largely because there's a market for it. And they would lack access to those markets if they were using GMO grain. So a lot of them are paying attention to it for those reasons, but also, like the inevitability, like I was saying, so for example, Buffalo Trace, massive whiskey producer in Kentucky, they have an experimental warehouse that's looking at all different kinds of aspects of whiskey production and what makes bourbon taste different ways. I think some of those experiments are looking at anticipating what happens with more dramatic weather swings and more dramatic temperature grades with climate change, taking that kind of information to inform themselves moving forward of how do we how we have to take this into consideration. How are we going to do that? So I think there's a variety of perspectives in terms of how forward and how open companies are being and talking about this. Some producers are very open. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Mountain Gay Rum in Barbados, where they're doing lots of environmental initiatives, partially because they're on a small island with a limited amount of water, and they kind of have to deal with this. So I think a lot of companies are looking at this in one level or another.
Good to know. All right, Jeff asks, do you have an opinion on bars that barrel age their own cocktails? I barrel age at home, so I know a barrel is only good for several batches before it needs to be replaced.
I think barrel aged cocktails can be delicious. I would say, if you can buy a used barrel, that would be great. I don't really know much about bars like charring their own barrels after they've been aged to kind of sterilize it and make sure that it's okay for the next round. But it sometimes though, if you put something in a barrel, it can last for a long time. So maybe you'll just batch a lot of it so you can get more uses out of it.
Paul, did you have any thoughts there?
I was going to say it may also be kind of an issue of scale. When we're thinking of sustainability, using a small barrel to barrel age cocktails, it's like the plastic straw thing. It's something that you can look at this and say, here's a way I can reduce my impact, but in levels of magnitude, it's tiny. So there are many bigger problems to worry about. So barrel age, it will.
Yeah.
Barrel aged at will. There you have it. Heard it here first. Okay. Well, that is all of our questions tonight, and I think that's all that we have time for. Shanna and Paul, it was a pleasure hearing the both of you chat, being a bit of a fly on the wall over here on my end. And thanks so much for taking the time to join our virtual audience. Really fantastic talk. Can't wait to dive into this book. For anyone that is listening at home, we will have this talk posted on our YouTube channel within 48 hours. So if you want to refer back to the conversation or share this event with anyone who didn't get to attend tonight, that will be posted there, and you will receive a link sent straight to your inbox via Zoom after the event. On behalf of Book Larder, thanks so much for joining us, and have a good night, everyone. Stay dry out there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Thanks for such amazing questions. That was really great. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. It was great chatting with you.
Fantastic. Take care.
See you.
Bye.